Hi guys, Mike Fellman here. Today we're going to be looking at a very famous game between Paul Morphy and it says Carl Isward here, but the story is he was playing a Duke and a Count in a Paris cafe. This game is frequently known as Morphy versus the Duke and the Count. It's going to involve looking at some of the double king pawn structures we did in my opening primers lesson, as well as kind of showing important themes like pins and skewers and, well, no skewers, but pins and the importance of development. And so it's a good continuation of the opening primer. So Morphy had white, knight f3. Again, we talked about how ideally here we'd like to play f4 to remove this center pawn, but here on f4, of course, ef4, we're down a pawn. And d4, we talked about why that doesn't work, because it prematurely brings our queen to the center, and he gets knight c6 and gets some nice development. And again, you can look back on my openings primer video, which will explain all this more in depth. So knight f3, giving up on f4, but preparing d4, d6, Philidor's defense, d4, and now black played a dubious move, but one that certainly has some ideas behind it, and we're going to talk about it. So he played bishop g4. So what's the idea here? Well, of course, d4, we know that white is trying to break down black's pawn chain, which is this d6 e5 pawn chain is black's main instrument or edifice for controlling the center. So white wants to break it down. Now he can't take it with a piece, obviously, so he needs to push up a pawn. Use a pawn to attack here. So that's all great, and d4 is the best move. And so black reasoned here. He said, well, this knight on f3 is really putting a lot of pressure. Is white's really only way to put pressure on e5 and d4. So if I can trade it off, I'll be sitting pretty in the center. So after a move like what happened in the game, bishop g4, de5, bishop f3, queen f3, de5, it looks like, well, this e5 pawn looks pretty darn secure. And it looks like white really can't put any more pressure on black. Fortunately, so that was black's reasoning. So unfortunately, although white will not be able to attack e5 effectively anymore, black is now exposed on the light squares because he's given up his light squared bishop. The c8 bishop is best light square mover, and he put this pawn, his central control is on dark squares. So he's really lacking for light square control. So white went ahead and played bishop c4, another light squared attacker, and gaining a tempo, hitting f7. And knight f6 dubious. Again, right idea, wrong execution. We need to stop, well, first of all, we need to stop checkmate, right? We need to stop queen f7 checkmate. So knight f6 brings out a piece, controls some light squares, so it achieves two objectives. Unfortunately, white can up the pressure and has a nice fork here. So queen b3, hitting f7 and hitting b7 at the same time. So black's already in a lot of trouble. So is there another way we can control light squares and stop mate? Well, there is. And it's queen d7 exclam, stop mate, and we put our queen on a light square. So our queen is now going to take the place of our light squared bishop and help us shore up the light squares. So on queen b3, for example, we have c6, placing a pawn on a light square and defending this point. So we're not playing like c5, which also defends b7 but doesn't help us control light squares. So c6, so we control this d5 and b5 square, both light squares. Now we can use these pawns to control some light squares. And black is still worse, but he's keeping his disadvantage to a minimum. And so I'm curious if anyone's ever if this has ever been played. Yeah, so there's a couple games. No one really any good, but you know, people have tried that. Unfortunately, knight f6 dubious, queen b3. hitting b7 and f7. So he has to stop. He really can't allow. So if he makes a move, if he defends b7, oh, new variation. Bishop and the king is uncomfortable, and white can just continue his development with even knight c3, bishop g5, and attack the weak king. And things are getting ugly. So he has to defend the f7 point. So he played queen f7, or queen e7, excuse me. So queen e7, again, a dark square and blocking this bishop in. So this is definitely not the right square for the queen. We really would have to get our queen to d7. So I would have probably played queen d7, queen b7, queen c6, let him trade queens, go into the bad endgame down a pawn, and try to survive. Queen e7 also more importantly, it blocks in this bishop. And so I tell my students, this bishop and this rook can't really move. The rook can go to g8, but it's no better on g8 than it was on h8. So black, through the whole game, is essentially playing down a bishop and a rook. And it's all because of this queen e7 move. So knight c3, well, what about queen b7? Well, we win a pawn, but queen b4 check, queen b4, bishop b4 check, c3, bishop d6. And now, black's not down a rook and a bishop anymore, so Morphy decided he wanted to go for more than just win a pawn. Now, black is much worse here and is probably dead lost, but he's not. Morphy decided that, well, having such constricted development is worth more than just winning a pawn. Keeping black tied down is worth more than a pawn. So he played knight c3, and some commentators, notably Kasparov, gave knight c3 2 exclams, and I tend to agree with that. Although the very quick win that ensues is made possible by knight c3, but black was not forced to make this further mistake. So c6, defending b7, controlling light squares. So c6 is the best move. Bishop g5, so now this knight doesn't move. And now on the unfortunate move, b5 question mark, which loses on the spot. So what's the problem with black's position? Well, he has two main problems. The light squares are one, and the other one is he's essentially down, at the moment, he's down a rook and a bishop. So he desperately needs to develop his pieces, so he can't play knight bd7 because it's queen b7. He can't play queen c7 and knight bd7 because f7 falls. So like, for example, bishop f7 check. So he really doesn't want to play like g6 or something. So because then bishop f6, queen f6, queen b7, g6 would be to get this bishop out. So two kind of desperate ideas I saw one was h6, bishop f6, gf6. If he plays here, we play g5, as ugly as it looks, and bishop g7, and we're getting our pieces out, and it's not pretty, but we're at least surviving. We're not going to be down. We're not going to have pieces doing nothing. Okay. And the other move is knight a6 exclam, which does allow him to give us a ton of weaknesses, but we need to just accept it and get our pieces out. Bishop f6, gf6, queen c4, queen b7, castles queenside, and black's still much worse. We have all these weak pawns. He has no place to put his king. But at least now he can play maybe something like bishop e7. Yeah, I like doubling on the d file. Castles. And blacks can use some of these pieces now. He's not just fighting without his left arm, essentially. But b5, and so Morphy sacks the piece. Knight b5, cb5, bishop b5 check, knight bd7. So this piece can't move. The knight on d7 can't move. The knight on f6 can't move. The bishop can't move, and the rook can't move. So, and we have two pawns for the piece. So great compensation. You know, 4 of white 6 pieces can't do anything, and we already have a lot of material to piece. So castles queenside, bringing another rook, attacking this pinned piece. rook d7 exclam, rook d7, rook d1. So now essentially only one of black's pieces can move. Queen e6. And now very pretty mating sequence. Bishop d7 check, knight d7, queen b8 check, knight b8, rook d8 checkmate. And so the reason White was able to win this game is if we look at, so we have 1, 2, boom, boom, boom. We have 4 attackers, 3 defenders. And the reason we were able to get a superiority of force here is because these pieces never moved. And actually the rook can't really move and the knight couldn't move either, so these really, it's hard to count these as defenders too. So b5, see this one, bishop b5 check, knight bd7, and just none of black's, again, none of black's pieces can move really. Rook d1. So there you have it. This is a very famous game to look at. It's been commentated on for years, especially because the final position is called a pure mate, where all of the white pieces are participating in the checkmate. So this is something to look at. We got to see in the beginning this odd attempt by white, or by black, to shore up his center, and how it fails because it exposes the light squares after we've put our pawns on dark squares. We saw this interesting queen d7 move, which would have kept his disadvantage to a minimum, because queen d7 to immediately shore up some light squares, putting the queen on a light square so the queen replaces our light squared bishop. And finally, again, we saw what can happen to you if you just neglect your development and you end up playing effectively down a bunch of pieces. So this is Mike Feldman signing off.